Welcome everybody to tonight's virtual Ideas on Tap. I've got a gin and tonic. I'm sad that I don't get to have snacks and other drinks with all of you in person tonight, and I was especially looking forward to being at the Institute of Politics because it's such a legendary venue in our state. But we're all at home, and so as many of you know, New Hampshire Humanities brings you free humanities content now in this exciting digital format. You can check out our website for upcoming events like our Black Thought series that Anthony mentioned. We also do adult literacy and English language learning programs, workplace programs, and community project grants. So if you'd like to find out more about New Hampshire Humanities and the work we do, you can go to nhhumanities.org. We're the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. So here we go. Our panelists tonight, in alphabetical order, we have Dr. Andrew Moore, who is Professor of History and Director of Summer School at Saint Anselm College. He is the author of the book, The South's Tolerable Alien, Roman Catholics in Alabama and Georgia, and the editor of Evangelicals in Presidential Politics, From Jimmy Carter to Donald Trump. He's also published several articles and book chapters. He teaches courses on, among other topics, American politics and race and civil rights for African Americans. So Andrew Moore is who you're going to want to direct your modern US history and politics questions to this evening. We've also got Dr. Beth Salerno, who is Professor of History at Saint Anselm College. She's the author of the book Sister Societies, Women's Anti-Slavery Organizations in Antebellum America. She's currently writing a biography of Concord, New Hampshire native abolitionist and revolutionary granddaughter Mary Clark, which is very exciting. And she teaches courses on US citizenship, environmental history, American women's history, antebellum America, and New England history. So we're gonna have to ask her some questions tonight about the 19th Amendment, of which we've just celebrated the 100th anniversary of its passage. So we'll hear more about that tonight from Dr. Salerno. And then we've got Dr. Dianna Gahlsdorf Terrell, and she's an associate professor of education at St. Anselm, where she teaches curriculum and assessment and education policy and supervises student teachers. Her research interests include civic, democratic, and socially just education, assessing outcomes of social science education, teacher education, and the impact of teacher evaluation systems. Her current research project, A Well-Informed Citizenry, explores social studies teachers' classroom practices in New Hampshire, as well as whether and how state policy informs those practices. And prior to working in higher education, she was a high school social studies teacher in Connecticut. And you can find a video of her Well-Informed Citizenry project on our website as one of the resources to accompany tonight's program if you're interested. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to talk a little bit more about their work and how it relates to our topic tonight of voting in America. Thank you very much for joining us, and we will now hear from Andrew. Andy.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. This is very exciting. Very briefly, as Tricia said, I teach courses on the American Civil Rights Movement. I teach a course on the New South, so the American South, and teach about the American presidency, the history of that. And in the context of those courses, we talk about the practice of disenfranchisement, so taking away the right to vote based on race, and in the context of the civil rights movement and the struggle to regain the vote in the 20th century, and then for the New South, the process of taking away the right to vote, and then the efforts to resist the civil rights movement, so the anti civil rights movement I teach about as well. And I put on, I sent to Tricia a couple of resources that I think she put on the website, examples of literacy tests and just the tactics that states used to violate the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which says that the right to vote cannot be taken away because of race or previous servitude. So still states found ways to get around that without mentioning race. The Supreme Court said that was okay in 1898, said that on their surface, the laws did not violate 15th. And so that was that for about, 70 years or so. So that's, I teach that. Those resources on the website I use with my students, and they're interesting, not mentioning race except to be about race. And I welcome your questions. So.
Thank you. Dr. Salerno, will you talk a bit about yourself?
Sure. I come at voting from two different directions. This is not my specialty. I'm not a scholar of voting per se, but I study, in studying women's history, I study women who came to voting with a sense of wanting equality, but I also study women who came to voting out of a moral sense of being fundamentally different from men. And I find fascinating how those two strains came together in the 19th Amendment out of anti-slavery activism. And I think we can see parts of that even in the present. But my other route into voting is I teach a course on American citizenship. And I teach it to both freshmen and seniors, two different versions. So I have had to get up to speed on the fact that the United States used to let non-citizen males vote when they still didn't let female citizens vote. Questions of the territories. We have places where the 19th Amendment was not effective in 1920, and places, of course, in the territories where people still don't get to vote in the way mainland citizens do. I take a look at questions of age, disability, things that we tend to think less about unless they're either someone we know or an issue we're focused on. The race and gender, because there are amendments about them, are a little more obvious. My students are very aware there's an amendment about age, because if you're between 18 and 21, the vote may feel a little more tentative than it does when you're over 21, since that was also an amendment. I was also a resident of Washington, D.C., so I have lived in the quote-unquote territories and been denied my senator and congressman. D.C. license plates, if you don't know, say no taxation without representation. The revolution is still alive. So I bring those experiences more than my specific scholarly research, and so I welcome questions from any of those angles.
Thank you. And Dianna.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much to the New Hampshire Humanities and to Tricia from Ideas on Tap for organizing tonight's event and for having me. So as Tricia mentioned at the beginning, my name is Dianna Gahlsdorf Terrell. Like my colleagues here on this panel, I'm a teacher at Saint Anselm College, a professor at Saint Anselm College. I'm in the education department and I teach teachers. So one area of research that I'm engaged in is studying the ways that social studies education and civic education in particular leads to or fails to lead to subsequent civic engagement. So unlike my colleagues on the panel, the research I'm engaged with is with citizens who are not yet old enough to cast a ballot, like Beth was just talking about. So you may wonder, why am I here? So the one thing that we do know about preparing children and adolescents for democratic participation is that this, of course, happens well before they turn 18. So probably many people here are aware of the research that shows that most civically engaged and active people are raised in politically active families, and they develop those habits of mind and habits of practice, around the dinner table, talking to their family about politics. So my research really evolved from my experience in the early 2000s teaching as a social studies teacher at the high school level. I was very committed to helping the adolescents in my classroom develop their political voice and their identity. And I found it really curious that the ways that most schools in the nation try to do this is through teaching history. And at that time, I was wondering what were particular teaching or pedagogical moves that I could use that would make my students more likely to be active, more inclined toward democratic activism, and that's what's led to my research. So recently, like Tricia was mentioning, I've been researching social studies teachers in New Hampshire. which by most measures is an outlier in terms of our national educational performance on a lot of measures relative to the rest of the nation. And I found essentially that social studies teachers in New Hampshire are outliers as well, which might explain some of the success that our state has had in terms of showing up at the polls. So I'm really, like my colleagues, very interested in hearing your questions about my work and whatever I can do to answer them. And some I can't answer, I also look forward to. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody. This is great. So we can do, obviously there's so many things we can cover tonight if the topic is voting in America, right? So we can do a deep dive into some of these historical issues, but we can also think about New Hampshire and the state of civic education and voting today. So we've got a huge range of topics we can cover with experts who can help us dig in and answer some of these questions. So I want to start by just asking a couple questions of the panel to get us going. I want to start with just kind of a basic definition of terms. So what are voting rights in the United States? Who gets to vote? Who still can't vote? Why?
It's like a question for the citizenship expert.
Well, I'll give the short answer. In the United States, you have to be 18 to vote. In most states, you have to show some kind of US identification. That can range widely across the states, but you basically have to prove that you're a resident in order to vote. Normally that's a town resident as much as a state resident. All of our voting rights are local. The Constitution does not actually set any voting rights. It simply tells states what they can't prohibit. Gender is not a factor, religion's not a factor, race is not a factor on the face of it. Those can be factors intentionally or unintentionally. Disability is the most common, quote unquote, unintentional one, by not thinking to make the polling place accessible. That's often a major difficulty, but definitionally, any citizen over 18 can vote in the United States. Whether that vote counts for president, senator, or congressman is the next question. So in the territories, Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, and the Virgin Islands, they can vote in primaries because primaries are run by basically non-for-profits. The Democratic and Republican Party are not officially part of our government. Those areas cannot, however, vote for senators, congressmen, except for DC, which does have a congressional representative, just not one who can vote. And their votes in DC count for president because we amended the Constitution, the 23rd Amendment, but they do not count in any of the other territories. Boy, I said I was going to give you the short version. You got all the details.
I would add that just because voting rights are a state level issue, in most states, convicted felons cannot vote, which in its practice, as Beth was saying, has the unintentional, we can assume, unintentional, maybe, impact of having a disproportionate impact on men of color. So felons cannot vote. And so that's one of the rights they lose even after they paid their debt to society.
And is that changing a little bit state by state?
I think there are movements, to change. So
yeah, Liz has just, Liz Tentarelli from the
League of Women Voters.
Thank you. Just noted that in New Hampshire, felons can vote. Different states do it differently. In some states, it's automatic. The second you serve your time, you automatically get to vote. In some states, you have to apply. And in some states, there's no application. There is no way to regain your voting rights. So it's very state dependent.
And when we're thinking about how this has changed over time, so Beth, you mentioned that the right to vote isn't exactly in the Constitution, that a lot of these rules are left up to the states, right? So how has that changed over time? Who was voting in the early days of the American Republic compared to who votes now?
I love the example that because the Constitution doesn't say, women voted in the state of New Jersey till 1807, because you simply had to have property. And the two richest people in New Jersey before 1807 were women. So they voted, as did a number of other women. Starting in the 1820s, most states changed their laws to take away the property requirement and make it a tax-paying requirement, but at the exact same time also added white and male. So you went from, in a sense, having earned a right to vote or having inherited it, if it's inherited property, to having it be biological, to the extent that race and gender are biological. That's how they would have understood it in the 1820s. Around the 1880s, when we have these huge waves of immigrants coming in, many states, including New York State, where I grew up, said as long as you looked white and as long as you were male and as long as you intended to become a citizen, you could vote, because voting was understood to be male. But if you were a born US citizen, you still couldn't vote in New York State. So again, we move from sort of a right based in property, a standing right, you have a stake in society, to states primarily went to a property holding tax, more tax paying, any level of tax paying, or what they called universal male suffrage, meaning white and male.
And again, that was, I'm sorry, Beth, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and over 21. You had to be over 21 until the Vietnam War.
In the 60s. So just to reiterate that was, again, these were all state level decisions until the age change. And so in some contexts, for a long time, this was considered, the trend Beth's describing was considered democratic, lowercase d, democratic. If you lower the property qualifications for voting, and you then, as new states in what was then the frontier, Tennessee, Kentucky, and then as Alabama, those states became states after the original 13. They didn't have the property requirements. So in a sense, this perception at the time was, yeah, this is toward more democracy. Although, as Beth points out, it actually, at the same time, put up other restrictions. This was happening also just in a different context, that slavery was becoming more important in national politics. And so there are some ironies here, but so yeah.
If I could jump in there, is that okay?
Yep.
I saw a question go by about Native Americans, and it's a really good question that I just want to address briefly. So Native Americans got to be US citizens in a huge variety of ways. Their tribe might have been given US citizenship anywhere from the 1830s on as a tribal unit. They may have gotten citizenship under the Dawes Act in the 1880s, in which Native Americans gave up all quote unquote non-personal land. So tribal land would be given up. 40 acres would go to each individual member of the tribe. And in exchange for giving up all that land, they would get citizenship in 20 years when they had sort of grown up and earned it, was the way it was worded. Incredibly paternalistic, racist language. And then in 1924, all Native Americans were given US citizenship, whether they wanted it or not. However, voting is a state right. And so as far as I know, the last state to finally allow Native Americans to vote was in the 1950s in Arizona and New Mexico, that Native Americans were denied voting privileges in those states based on race. We still have issues today in some places. Some states don't allow polling places on Native American reservations. And so it can be 100 or 150-mile drive to vote. Those aren't about law per se, right? The Native Americans on the reservations have the right to vote. Whether they have access or not is a different question. So I thought that was a great question, and I just wanted to make clear, as Andy was saying, starting in the 1830s, Native Americans are given citizenship. There's this sense of, well, we're expanding democracy, but the vote for all the other Native Americans is not coming with it. We're sort of hand-picking who we think is appropriate as a member of democracy.
So even today, we still have groups of people who are essentially disenfranchised for a variety of reasons, right?
Exactly.
So I see another good question. So as we're building on this issue of how voting rights have changed over time, Elizabeth DeBrule from the New Hampshire Historical Society, hi Elizabeth, asks, how did the Voting Rights Act of 1965 affect voting rights? So what changed with that? So I think we've talked a bit about this legislation, the 19th Amendment. The Voting Rights Act is another big, very relevant piece of legislation here.
Yeah, hey, Elizabeth. I think just to back up a little bit and give some history, after the end of the Civil War and the 15th Amendment of the Constitution in 1870, as Beth said earlier, Constitution tells states basically what they cannot do. And so the 15th Amendment says that the right to vote cannot be taken away because of race or previous servitude, and there's a list there. And so, so what states started to do after that was pass a variety of laws that did not mention race, like literacy tests, poll taxes. Multiple ballots was a way kind of to test literacy without having the test, but ways that were intended to restrict the right to vote, or actually they were tools used by a white registrar to decide who could vote and who could not vote, so that effectively Black men were deprived of the right to vote. They were disenfranchised, and this begins in the late 19th century. And then in 1898, in Williams v. Mississippi, the Supreme Court said that that was okay, that these efforts were constitutional. And so from until 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, in response to pressure from activists on the ground, the Voting Rights Act essentially gave the federal government the authority to monitor elections, and to make sure that African Americans were actually being allowed to vote. So essentially, the Voting Rights Act looked at who was actually voting, and if a state continued to show in these same trends of African Americans being denied the right to vote, then the Justice Department would bring suit. So then a court would step in and then resolve this. But the short answer to the question, how did it affect voting rights, was that it affected them dramatically. The percentage of the electorate, like and I don't have my notes in front of me, but prior to the Voting Rights Act, the 5%, and I'm making these numbers up, but like 5% of the electorate in, say, Mississippi was made up of African Americans. After the Voting Rights Act, it was like 65%, but it was that dramatic, and that was true across the board in most states. And the Voting Rights Act was in effect until very recently. Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, 2014, very recently, where the Supreme Court actually vacated part of it and said that it was no longer necessary or applicable. But the short answer to the question is it had a very traumatic impact.
Thank you. So we've got another question in the chat from Christine, who says, I'm very curious about New Hampshire being an outlier with regard to citizenship outcomes. What makes the difference to the exercise of these hard-won rights? So Dianna, I think this is one for you.
Thank you. Hi, Christine. Yes, I think what we've found in terms of outcomes for what we're kind of using as a proxy for understanding citizenship skills are New Hampshire's students' performance on some nationwide high-stakes standardized tests. And some nationwide tests, like Andy is talking about the Voting Rights Act, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was similarly passed around the same time. Its most recent iteration is the Every Student Succeeds Act. Prior to that, it was No Child Left Behind. And each of these iterations of those have required that states monitor their students' progress in a variety of subjects. And No Child Left Behind basically took that up a notch and said, you need to test your students yearly in grades 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and once in high school on set subjects. At least it had to be math and English, and English could be nonfiction literacy. So I'm using, when I say that New Hampshire is a national outlier, I'm looking specifically at the National Assessment of Education Progress, which is data on students' performance that the nation has been collecting on the National Center for Education Statistics. People can Google that. I can put it into the chat box too if you're interested. That has state by state disaggregated data on how our students are performing on those measures. And so what I'm saying about civic outcomes is that our students tend to perform in the top 10 states, at least the top 10 states. Recently, it's been in the top 5 states in grades 5, 8, and I think it's 11 that they measure argumentative writing. So we know that New Hampshire students are an outlier in terms of their ability to look across multiple data sources, to media sources, to form an opinion and articulate a position on something nonfiction, so something to do with informational texts. So that's one of the proxies that we use to kind of think about, because we don't have, of course, we don't have a voter participation for kids under 18 because they're not really showing up to cast a ballot because they're not, they don't yet have the right to vote. So that would be our proxy for how do our students in New Hampshire understand how to make sense of competing media claims and take a position on something political and articulate that position. We also have one of the highest rates of social capital in New Hampshire. So the sense of community spirit, of community getting together, of participation in civic organizations and that kind of thing. So any work on Bob Putnam, more recently updated in the book, Our Kids, talks about sort of New Hampshire as a national outlier in the civic mindedness and the sort of capacity to deliberate about topics that there might be a lot of dissension and a lot of tension, but we're able to teach our students, and then as grown-ups respectfully disagree, though things have become a little bit more polarized, I would say. But by most measures, I guess I would say that that's how we know that the civic outcomes in the state are a national outlier. Hopefully that answers the question.
Well, I want to follow up on that. I want to hear more about why. What is it? What is different about New Hampshire? I mean, that's a question that we ask, every primary season also, but
yeah.
in
Why
general.
New Hampshire? Yeah, I think we have a really powerful, yeah. So I think that's part of it. It's sort of the Yankee, like the New England democracy, the town hall kind of feeling, the first in the nation, pride and excitement, the fact that we're a state that's so small and we get to see, being at Saint Anselm in, primary season is like, it's a parade of all of the, primary candidates. It's really, it's like having a national front row seat to this political conversation that's happening nationally. And I think that the Granite Staters take this very seriously and they are really engaged in it. So this research that I'm doing is, and I don't want to overstate the connection, but I will say that New Hampshire teachers of social studies really take this very seriously as well. So everybody's drinking the water or whatever's in the water. And New Hampshire teachers tend to engage in the pedagogical moves that we know tend to engage adolescents and children and in democratic skills, like deliberation, like the capacity to learn how to disagree without attacking, and just those kinds of things that New Hampshire teachers are really taking up in the classroom, far more so than teachers nationwide. And that's sort of been borne out in the research that I'm doing recently with my colleague, Dr. Kevin Doran. So, I mean, of course, I study teacher preparation, teacher education, and social studies, so I want it to be teachers. But I do think it's a pretty compelling argument when you look at really how different New Hampshire teachers are from national trends.
That's fascinating. And let's take a minute to appreciate our New Hampshire teachers, especially my colleague at New Hampshire Humanities, Mary Nolan, who runs our Connections program and is a former social studies teacher in New Hampshire. So hi, Mary, I know you're listening. But thank you to all of our high school teachers in this very difficult time right now. We appreciate them, and we certainly raise a glass because apparently they're doing an amazing job when it comes to civics education, which is really encouraging to hear. So I had another question about that coming up in the chat, which was also a question about our ruralness, if that's related to not having large cities, but also our huge state house of volunteers. Liz asks if our huge state house and of volunteers, if that has an impact on this civic participation as well.
I feel like I've had the mic for a little while, so I'm gonna turn to my colleagues in the history department and see if they have something they want to contribute here.
I don't really answer that question, so.
All I can add to that is we do know historically that places where there's broader participation does tend to lead to more laws to expand voting, that when you have a very small group of people, whether it's one race or one class doing the voting, that does not tend to lead to expansions of voting. I don't know if specifically having a very large volunteer state house helps, but clearly the more people in the state house, the more possibility for broad representation within the state. And that might lead to outcomes where there aren't as many limitations on voting and there's more widespread support for open voting, democratic voting.
Yeah, New Hampshire's history in the, our system of the executive council, our large House of Representatives. These are also very interesting factors which we could delve into tonight, which seem to make New Hampshire again a bit odd in state governing. So we've got a lot of questions in the chat. Let me see if I can get to some more. We had a question from Elsa about states where voters have been taken off the rolls. So can any of you speak to voter rolls and voter suppression in recent elections?
I know that this happened in Georgia recently, right? In response to a state law. Kemp was his name, right? Brian Kemp, who was at the time was the Secretary of State for Georgia. remove large numbers of voters from the rolls who had not voted or whose residency couldn't be confirmed, or they couldn't be found, or he claimed they had moved out of state, and so he removed large numbers of people. And I don't know figures offhand, but this caused, of course, controversy because he was also running for governor, and he defeated Stacey Abrams in that election, and she and others in the state, claimed that his efforts to remove people from the rolls amounted to suppression and really cost her the election. And Georgia is one I'm most familiar with, so Beth or Dianna may know more than that. But that is a recent example where you throw in examples of states kind of cleaning up their roles from their perspective, or cleaning them up, and you throw it into a polarized environment already, and it's an ugly hot mess, right? So
I won't follow up with a particular example, but I will raise a related and larger, not larger issue, but philosophical way of looking at it. As we've mentioned before, our Constitution doesn't tell states how to do their voting. And the reason for that was when the Constitution was written, the biggest fear was an overbearing federal government. People wanted power closer to the people. We didn't even elect our senators in the original Constitution. You only elected your congressman, your state legislature elected your senator, and as we've all discovered recently, we also don't vote for president, we vote for electors. And the goal was the electors were wiser than us, and so they weren't bound, they could vote for whoever they wanted. These were all designed as a balance between democracy, which, to be honest, most Americans at the time of the Constitution thought was our biggest problem, that democracy was scary, majorities might take away rights from other groups, and so they wanted power at the states where people could keep an eye on it. We have come in later years to recognize that sometimes a federal government isn't an overbearing tyranny, it's a protection when things go wrong at the state level. That the balance between state and federal sometimes works to our advantage. And so when states do purge their voter rolls, they are doing what the Constitution allows them to do, which is make decisions about what's appropriate in their jurisdiction. But we no longer have the balance of a federal government that sort of looks in and says, no, that's inappropriate, that violates the Voting Rights Act, or you're not following the rules that we laid out in the amendments related to voting. You're disproportionately affecting a group based on race. That's a violation of the 15th Amendment. So we've always had this fear of either an overbearing federal government or these days too strict a local government that's disproportionately affecting one group, sometimes intentionally. Getting back to a balance that works better for any location really requires citizens to accept that sometimes democracy goes wrong, and sometimes a larger government can be tyrannous. We got to accept a little bit of tyranny and a little bit of democracy getting out of hand and find the balance in the middle. That's why I mean it's a philosophical answer, but I think it's one that we've struggled with for a long time. Purging of the voter rolls is not a new problem if we think about it as governed, in this case, state tyranny without a balance.
So Beth, since you brought up the Electoral College, I'm going to need someone to explain that to all of us. Why do we have it and how does it work? And we also have, we've got a question in the chat from Nancy who says, New Hampshire has 4 electoral votes. Who are these individuals? So who can answer that question? Who can explain succinctly what is the Electoral College and why? Why do we have it?
Does anyone else want to take that on? If not, I'm happy to do that one. It was my student question last class.
I'll start. You can pick up and finish. So like Beth said, at the Constitutional Convention, there was a concern over democracy. And the truth is, at the convention itself, there was no movement for a popular vote for president. There were a few lone voices, kind of outliers, but most people kind of laughed and said, okay, now let's get serious. The people cannot do this. They cannot choose the president. So there were options floated, maybe the Congress should choose the president, or maybe the states should do it, like state legislatures should do it, or state governors should do it. And each of these options represented overlap. Like if you let Congress do it, then Congress has too much influence over the president. He's beholden to them and he's not independent of them. If you let governors do it, then states already are choosing senators. So their rights are protected there in the Senate as states. And so the Electoral College was a way to balance these competing ideas, because nobody truly was sold on popular vote. The people voted for the House of Representatives, and so the people had their say there. States voted for senators, and so states had their say there. And so the Electoral College was a way, it was a compromise. And it has evolved. And at the time, the Constitution did not take into account political parties even. So the Electoral College became kind of a nominating body. And so, and that actually was the vision some people had, that you get kind of, favorite sons from this region against that region. And then really this would boil down to Congress choosing from among, these regional favorites. But and so with the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, that allowed for political parties to nominate candidates and choose a president and a vice president. But really since then, it's not changed. It's not changed, and there have been incidences, as we heard in 2016, as we know from 2016, when the person who won the popular vote was not chosen president. It's happened a few times, and the question about who the 4 are for New Hampshire, the short answer is that depends on on which party's nominee is gets the votes, right? So those are chosen by the parties.
So if I can, Andy, I'll jump in here. The electors, Andy's right, were meant to be people who knew more people in the country. Because at the time of the Constitution, if you were from Massachusetts, you knew nobody from Georgia. And the fear was there wouldn't be enough knowledge. So the electors were meant to be state senators, leaders from each state, people of great reputation, which also meant white, male, and fairly wealthy. And they were not to vote necessarily the way their constituents voted, because of course their constituents are the democracy, plebeians, also known as idiots, according to many of the people at the Continental Congress. Not intentionally. No one voted intentionally badly, but you didn't know enough. These people were meant to be, the word that's actually used is of more wisdom. So they were not bound. They were supposed to vote their conscience and vote who they thought would be best. It's important that people know those laws have changed in about 30 states. Now, there are electors from each party. Whichever party wins the majority in your state, those electors are the ones who cast a vote. In 30 states, that vote has to match the popular vote. In the other 20 states, it still does not. The argument is still they're supposed to use their wisdom. But we seem much more eager about democracy these days, and we really want, in most states, the popular vote to win. So the answer to who they are, you're actually, when you vote, that's who you're voting for. So that list has to be publicly available in every state. Most people don't know to ask for it, but each party makes that list, and that's literally who you're voting for, is whoever's on that list. You're saying those people can cast my ballot. So if you don't know who they are, our system is not working.
Well, so Beth, so you brought up this idea that the founding fathers did not have a particularly positive opinion of democracy, and yet as our nation has evolved, we've come to say that it's our role to not only bring democracy, have democracy in the United States, but to bring that to other countries across the globe. So we generally could say we have a more positive opinion about democracy as a concept than the founding fathers did. So in that case, why have we not moved towards popular election completely, right? So if we've got 30 states that are making electors follow the popular vote, why don't we have that for all 50 states? Why haven't we abolished the Electoral College?
There's two answers to that, I think. One is we're a republic. We don't use our language carefully. So the way I explain often to my students that we are not a democracy is nobody asks their opinion if we go to war. Right? No one asks your opinion. They ask you to tell your opinion to your congressman, and your congressman votes. They represent you. So that's the definition of a republic. So we've never been a democracy, and we don't actually want to spread democracy around the world for the most part. We're trying to spread representative government. So I think we do still share a lot of concern, but some people in society share a lot of concern still about democracy. But I think the other short answer is if we want to get rid of the Electoral College, we have to change the Constitution. That's 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and 3/4 of the states. And I'm not sure what color shoes someone has on. I don't think we could get agreement that that's the same color from 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states. I can't actually think of any topic on which we could get that agreement.
Yeah,
So I agree with you that I think a majority of Americans would love to get rid of the Electoral College, but I'm not sure we could get just the physical process of getting an amendment through. The last amendment was 1992. We have not gotten an amendment through since then. I'm sorry, Andy.
No, I cut you off, and I'm sorry. I spoke too soon. I was just going to reiterate that the truth is the Constitution has been changed very few times, in our history, and it's because it's tough to do. I think the founders they envisioned a way to change it. They knew that there would need to be changes, but they created a system that would need not universal appeal, but broad appeal, and we're not getting that these days. So it has not been changed very often. And yeah, Beth's right. We're not going to get that level of agreement anytime soon, I think. Unless I would probably hazard a guess that if we have a series of elections where the popular vote does not line up with the Electoral College, if 2016 becomes not an outlier but the trend, then we'll probably see in a few cycles like that probably more widespread interest in changing it. Until then, I wouldn't think.
So shifting gears a little bit, we've got a really interesting question from Janelle in the comments, and she says, how do major national events, i.e. 9/11, 2008 recession, affect presidential elections? And how do you think the COVID-19 pandemic will affect our election in November?
I'm sending that one to Dianna because she studies the future and I study the past.
Thank you, Beth. I was just thinking, and actually there was a related question that went through from, actually, I think that they're related, by Carolyn, who is a retired New Hampshire guidance counselor who was also doing a lot of work with students in getting them ready to, I guess, in civic education, I'm assuming, and was playing a role in that. And I'm just thinking about just, the effect of No Child Left Behind, which I think is legislation that a few of you are familiar with on here that required school teachers to focus on English language arts and math. Really had such a deleterious effect on teaching social studies that I'm not surprised to see that Carolyn was very active as the school guidance counselor in helping elementary school children learn how to kind of get along, because social studies wasn't happening anymore in elementary classrooms. And I think that we're seeing the impact of that. I think that we're seeing the impact of 18 years of education policy that has put math and English language arts at the forefront and put social studies on the back burner, and hasn't really talked about a big part of public schooling, which is helping children learn to get along with people with whom they disagree, and to advocate for the rights of people for whom they disagree with, or sorry, not with whom they disagree, but who they are not. So how do we, make sure everybody is having a just and equitable opportunity to voice their perspective? So I think related to that, and this gets to the 9/11 issue, I think we've raised a generation of people, of Americans, because of our education policy, that may be really shying away from, so there's two sides to this. It can have like one or the other outcome, I think. It can be either like, and I think it's generational, that we have a lot of older adults, young adults, older adolescents who are coming into an opportunity to vote, and they're scared. I think that there's like this sort of tension between safety and taking a risk, responsibility, fighting for justice, those kinds of things. And I think right now, we have a lot of kids who are really traumatized. We have a lot of college-age kids. Generation Z is a highly anxious, just generationally, highly anxious group of young adults and older adolescents. And so I think the fear that I think young adults are feeling right now, I'm worried that it will generate voter suppression, and it won't take much for people to be really terrified on election day and not show up. So that's, I feel like it's not like me to be pessimistic about the future, but I do think we're seeing a lag effect of decades of education policy that taught our students that social science, history, democratic participation is not at the front. It's not the biggest part of education that we need to be worried about. So
that's
sorry,
really interesting. It's great that you've connected those things to think about this this current generation of people who are turning 18 or around that age and would be likely to vote, were it not for these things that have been happening in this sort of cumulative effect over time of these policies. It's really interesting. Are there any things you can think of that we can do to fix that? before November, just real quick?
Well, I don't know. You know, it's like I teach about civics and I'm actually worried about mail-in ballots. I mean, one of the parts of this subtitle is about the absent, and I'm kind of like, do I trust mail-in ballots at this point? Is that going to get counted? So if I'm somebody who pays attention to how you can vote and I try to teach people how to engage in democracy, and I'm skeptical that the processes that I have typically been, you know, believed are operating with good faith, if I'm questioning that, then that also makes me quite nervous. I do think that people like Carolyn, like I think every adult in a school, every adult that works with young adults or later adolescents who are coming into the vote, they all play a role in modeling democratic activism and participation in voting. And I think as like a lot of parents out here, you know, you have to kind of model for younger people for whom this might be their first general election, that, you know, voting is important. So I guess that's the biggest thing, is that kids learn by watching examples. You know, they learn by participating, they learn through action. So we have to walk the talk as adults and not be afraid, I think, so.
We've got a good point from Liz Tentarelli in the comments, and she's pointed out that in terms of COVID-19, New Hampshire greatly expanded absentee voting opportunities in this past, in the primary in September, and the result was record turnout. And so she says, will that hold for November? So that's the question. So, you know, thinking again about the title of tonight's talk, the good, the bad, and the absent, when we're thinking about voting in America, if anyone could speak to some of these changes in our state regarding voting recently, and particularly this, some of these precautions with COVID-19 and the absentee ballots, it sounds like it's went well for the primary. I went and voted in person because, like Dianna, I was worried about mail-in voting, to be honest. Beth?
I voted mail-in for the first time in my 21 years in New Hampshire, and it went just fine. I loved being able to check that my ballot was sent out to me, that it was received back. The Secretary of State's website lets you check, and it also indicates whether your ballot was counted and for what reason it might have been rejected. I also got mail from the post office recently that listed out, if you want to vote, here are your 5 steps that you should take. I was very appreciative that they reminded people to start early, since I was already telling my students that. But to pick up a little bit on the previous question, one of the things that I think is really hard in the current media environment is when I'm a historian talking about how voting has been suppressed in the past, some of my students will say, well, you know, don't you like America? That's their first response, is if you're criticizing the system, you must not like the system. And I have to explain that people who are deeply patriotic might want more people to participate in that process and might critique out of love, right? Your parents, I usually use the example of, you know, your parents aren't critiquing you because they hate you, they're critiquing you to make you better. But I think we've reached a point in our media landscape where criticism not only comes across as unpatriotic, but I think also discourages people. People think, well, my vote doesn't matter because votes didn't get counted in this place, or, well, they took all these people off the rolls and I don't know how much difference it made. There's a real discouragement and a real undermining of the power of voting. And yet we don't want to say everything's fine, right? Go out and vote, it'll really matter. Every vote will be counted, because that's disrespectful of the huge numbers that are of people and of votes that are not counted and who don't have access. So for me, how we find a way of saying, if you have a vote and you are able to exercise that vote, that is a privilege and has been historically. And you should use that in ways that you find powerful. For a lot of people, maybe that's voting for people who can't vote, expressing that power. But to simply not vote, which I think a fair number of people are doing. I'm a Jacksonian era historian, right? So 80% turnout was not unusual. we've been running sort of below 50%. And that level of discouragement is really a bigger problem to some extent than some of the other problems we've talked about, because that's people who have a vote, who are eligible to vote and are not exercising it. That means something. I'm not exactly sure what, but how we communicate about that seems critically important to me.
We have just a follow-up question on this from Brendan, who asks if someone can explain the differences between universal mail-in, as people have proposed in recent months, and absentee, which is the way most states allow people to vote by mail. Can one of you answer that?
As far as I know, universal mail-in is the state sends everybody a ballot to mail in if they choose to. Absentee, you have to take the initiative. You have to request a ballot. So it's who does the push, the state or you?
Okay. Different states have different requirements for absentee balloting. So you have to have a reason to want it. So are we traveling that day, or you need to specify the reason that you need that ballot. Versus mail-in ballot, you just say, I want to vote that way. And so, yeah, that's a difference there.
I feel very concerned that I might have my last comment be this super doomsday statement about absentee ballots. And I want to point out Barb's comment that, about town clerks and what a great job they're doing and having great confidence in the absentee. So I just want to make sure that that's something that I highlight. And I do have faith in the system. I would like to show up because I do feel like I want to bring my girls with me, which is a tradition. Every general election, they come with me to vote. And because the schools are closed usually, so that works out. And I also kind of wanted to point out one of the things that Beth was saying at the very end of her comments on the right to vote and how we've got this high 50s percentile. And I want to say also that civic, the right to vote and civic engagement actually with adolescents and children who are under 18, there is actually a civic engagement gap as well. And that is racial, and that is SES, like socioeconomic status. And that's something that, I'm very interested in trying to figure out getting to the bottom of that. But I think that we're seeing that, even though we're having, a high 50th percentile, there's still within demographic splits and trends within that voter turnout rate as well that we really need to attend to as a nation.
I think that question of how to make it easier for everyone to vote, we've talked about certainly having a national holiday for election day, any kinds of opportunities we can take to make it easier for people to actually go and vote, right? So I've got an interesting question from Anthony in the chat. He wants to know, I think Dianna, this is referring to your comment earlier, do you believe that my generation, Generation Z, has become a very anxious generation because of the traumatizing events through our lives, such as 9/11 and being at constant war? Has this led to a fear of getting involved in any way?
I don't have that kind of doctorate. I'm sorry. I think, so I have an education research doctorate and I look at trends and patterns in testing data. So this is just a little bit of an armchair kind of observation. Actually, there's a really great book called Generations that talks about the ebb and flow of those kinds of trends. And one of their, and this is a book that was written, I think, in the late 1990s. And it talks about how there are 4 main kinds of types of generations, and that, boomer generations, for example, that every 4 generations, there are boomer-like characteristics. And so the silent generation is sort of, kind of making if we follow their thesis, it's making an emergence. Certainly something like 9/11 is making people fearful. I think, I don't know, I would imagine too, the hyper exposure to social media and just the ways that we were talking about how Beth was talking about the difference of ideas and how that sort of feels threatening to people instead of looking for like-mindedness. So we have social media where we have these kind of ideological silos and everyone's, singing to the choir and back and forth to one another, people who they agree with. And so when you're exposed to people with whom you disagree, there's just sort of like I think that social media is amplifying that effect, that if somebody is disagreeing with me, then that, you know, it feels like an eternal assault. So I will sandwich this comment with, I don't have those kinds of credentials, but I guess that's my best answer for that one.
Seems to me that's a good answer, because just larger than politics, larger than the electorate, we know that social media is driving anxiety and depression, you know, in that generation. So I know my students now aren't old enough to have remember 9/11. But still, statistics point to the fact just how, you know, anxious they are and depressed they are, and then, you know, you combine that with the siloed information and, you know, well, you put those two things together, and you have kind of what we have now, right? An electorate that's checking out. Or, you know, wants to be engaged but doesn't know, you know, they don't trust sources of information. They're not their information literacy is weak, and, you know, a lot of people will just say, I don't know, I give up, don't know.
Andy, we actually, while you're speaking, we have a question specifically for you in the chat, which is from Mark, and he says, Andy, with your research on Southern U.S. Catholic history, how do single issue voters affect the presidential election politicking and election campaigning?
Well, historically, and we've seen not so much Catholics. This started with evangelicals in the 80s, I guess. So we see, you know, even evangelical Protestants kind of become more active politically in the late 70s and 80s, and it seems to me like there is a sizable enough single issue voting over, say, abortion, that you've got a pretty large segment of the Republican Party who that they've got voters who are not going to go anywhere, right? And so though, you know, those voters went 80% for Trump in 2016, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of movement. Well, polls, you know, seem to suggest those people aren't going anywhere really. So I would say that we, you know, over culture war issues like that, we do get a lot of single issue voters, and, you know, they still, you know, the right candidate can push those buttons, and they're not really engaged in the overall dialogue, right?
I would jump in to connect that to our title of The Good, the Bad, and the Absent, in the sense that that is very true for white and male voters. But as we add more female voters and more voters of color, the percentage of single issue voters goes down dramatically. And so one of the impacts of over time of having fewer women and fewer people of color on the rolls is single issue voting at all different historical periods could occur. So it's kind of fascinating to see what will happen to single issue voting if there's much more broad participation in voting, because other groups do not single issue vote in quite the same way.
That's a very interesting point. So we're actually running out of time, and I want to give each of our panelists a minute just to say any final thoughts or make any final points. If you saw something if there was something in the questions that you didn't have a chance to get to, this is your last chance to do it. So I'm going to go through and ask Andy, do you want to go first and just any final thoughts or points?
Not really. I think these are all great questions, and I don't know that I've contributed a whole lot of new knowledge. I certainly don't know the future, so I always tell students I'm a historian, not a futurist. But I think that this just reiterates that healthy dialogue is possible. That we can be informed by history, but then we can look ahead and be hopeful. So I will choose hopefulness, right? And not discouragement, although discouragement is my default normally. So based on this, I will choose differently. We can all choose differently. Thank you very much, Tricia.
Thank you, Andy. And we know historians can't predict the future, but we also know history influences things today. So it's important to have those perspectives. And I appreciate you bringing perspectives on 20th century US history to us tonight. Beth, would you like to go next? Final thoughts or any points we missed?
I'm going to leave you with the suggestion that I leave to all of my students, which is the Constitution is not very long. It will take you less time to read than you spent with us today. I highly recommend reading the US Constitution. My guess is you will be surprised by what's in there and what's not in there. You are also governed by a state constitution. I regularly tell my students in New Hampshire, you have a right to an adequate education, which does not show up in the national constitution. The absolute best thing, our best tool against ignorance is information. And those are our key sort of original documents. So take the time. And if you do have questions, I highly recommend Civics 101, the NHPR podcast. And if you absolutely can't get an answer from that, then you can email me.
Thank you very much. And Dianna, any final thoughts or last points you want to make?
I do have something very quick. Mostly, I just want to echo my colleagues, and it's really wonderful to be on the panel with them. And I'm happy that they're ending with a hopeful note. And so I will try to do the same. I did see one message very early on, a question about the low immigration numbers in New Hampshire, and wanted to kind of circle back very quickly and say, yes, there is a civic education gap. There's a civic a voting gap, and that our performance as a state in some ways reflects our highly homogeneous demography, and that the percentage of college graduates in our state also does. So I think as a state that has all of these sort of educational advantages, has an opportunity to really make sure that we teach our youth about the power of voting and the importance of voting. And we also have to recognize that this is not something statewide. There's real inequalities in pockets where there's civic deserts. So we really need to kind of figure out as a state, how do we make sure that those advantages that we are leveraging can extend throughout the state? I guess that would be what I would say. Thank you very much for including us.
Thank you. So I'm going to let Anthony Poor, our executive director, give us a couple closing remarks. But before I let him do that, I just want to say thank you very much to everyone, to all of our panelists, to Saint Anselm, to my colleagues at New Hampshire Humanities, and remind you that we're going to be sending you an email with a link to take a survey about tonight's program, and also that a lot of the resources we mentioned tonight, plus some new ones, will be up on our website, and it's nhhumanities.org/voting in America. And I think that was in the chat at some point earlier. So you can find some of those resources, Civics 101. Andy mentioned literacy tests. You can take historical literacy tests and see how you would have done. Diana's survey, you can find that information on that website. So please do check it out. So thank you very much from me, Tricia Peone, New Hampshire Humanities Public Programs Manager, and I'm going to pass it over to Anthony.
I'm going to be really quick. First and foremost, I want to say thank you, Tricia. Great job tonight. Ooh, thank you, Tricia. thought you did an excellent job. And really, I mean, as a colleague, as a peer, I just want to say thank you very much for a job well done. Obviously, I want to thank all the speakers tonight, Andy, Diana, Beth. I learned so much tonight. Thank you so much for sharing literally your scholarship, bit of yourself, and your wisdom. Cannot thank you enough. Don't forget that evaluation. And again, if you like this conversation, I just want to remind you all of next week's Black Thought conversation. The title of next week's talk is How Civil Rights, From Civil Rights to Black Lives Matter. So if you're interested in joining that conversation as we launch Black Thought, our second season of Black Thought, that'll be next Wednesday, September 23rd with Dr. Matt Delmont from Dartmouth. Additional information on our website as well. Again, nhhumanities.org/Black Thought. So with that being said, I just want to say thank you very much to everyone. Be safe, stay healthy, and if we can ever be of service in any way, never hesitate to call us. And we appreciate you. Bye-bye for now.
And vote also.
And vote. And vote.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thanks,
Good
Tricia.
night.
Good
Thank
job.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.